So I want to remind you to submit your questions to ask@greensciencepolicy.org. I was not correct before. Ask@greensciencepolicy.org. And then we're going to turn to the first of the 6 classes, which is highly fluorinated chemicals. They used to be called PFCs, but they're now called PFASs, and these complicated names are confusing and really don't help us a lot, but here I'll say it, it's per and polyfluorinated alkyl substances, a big mouthful, abbreviated PFASs, and PFCs are part of that big mouthful. And these chemicals are really in the news now because it was recently found that more than 6 million Americans' drinking water is polluted with these chemicals above health advisory levels recently established by the EPA. And people who are in these communities are very concerned. And it's a really important moment for people to get educated about these chemicals and reduce their use, not use them when they're not necessary. And as you will hear in a moment in the next video, there are things we can do, and these are perhaps among the most harmful classes of chemicals. So let's watch the next video.
Welcome. I'd like to tell you about highly fluorinated chemicals and ask the question, are non-stick and waterproof products worth our health? Highly fluorinated chemicals provide stain and water repellency. They're one of the 6 classes or families that contain many of the chemicals of concern found in consumer products and building materials. Although convenient, these chemicals are associated with serious health problems and they can remain in the environment forever. Highly fluorinated chemicals are man-made. When they are present, it's because they are manufactured, put into products, and disposed of. They can make their way from industrial plants and landfills into waterways, and then into our food and drinking water. We are also exposed from products in our homes and workplaces. Highly fluorinated chemicals are found in the bodies of 98% of Americans. Fetuses and children are especially vulnerable during critical windows of development. The most studied of these substances, called C8 or PFOA, has been linked to kidney and testicular cancer, elevated cholesterol, decreased fertility, thyroid disease, and interference with hormone function. When children have higher body levels of fluorinated chemicals, their vaccinations are less effective in protecting their health. These highly persistent and toxic substances travel long distances and pollute even the most remote places. They don't break down. They accumulate in the environment, causing harm for millions of years. More than 3,000 highly fluorinated chemicals are in use today. They're found in some carpets, carpet cleaning products, food packaging, furnishings, cosmetics, outdoor gear, clothing, adhesives and sealants, protective coatings, non-stick cookware, car seats, and firefighting foam. The well-studied chemical PFOA, called C8 because it contains 8 carbons, was phased out due to its toxicity and persistence. Hundreds of replacements are now in use, including C6, C4, and C3. These chemical cousins may be equally or even more problematic than C8, but information about them is kept a trade secret, leaving purchasers in the dark. All highly fluorinated chemicals, including the so-called safer substitutes, pose a potential risk. They should be avoided unless their function is essential. The 6 classes approach, avoiding the use of entire chemical classes of concern, can solve the problem of moving from one highly fluorinated chemical to the next. Before buying products containing highly fluorinated chemicals, ask, is the convenience worth the potential for harm? The good news is that some leading brands, IKEA, H&M, Crate & Barrel, Levi Strauss & Co., and many more, are eliminating all highly fluorinated chemicals. So what can you do? Choose textiles and carpeting without water and stain repellency. Avoid food in contact with grease-proof packaging, such as microwave popcorn and some fast foods. Avoid personal care products with perfluor, polyfluor, and PTFE on the label. Be wary of products labeled PFOA-free. They often contain similar chemicals instead. When possible, ask for products without highly fluorinated chemicals. At sixclasses.org, you can learn more about highly fluorinated chemicals and the other 5 classes, as well as view the entire video series. Brought to you by Green Science Policy Institute. Please share these videos for healthier products, people, and planet.
Okay, so what struck you as important in that video? Anybody want to answer that?
Sure. I think the important thing of recognizing here, and the thing that makes me concerned about this class, even as we see replacements, as the video points out, that replace the known bad actors with less well-known actors, is they stay around in the environment forever. And that inability to break down is what gives me a concern about the whole class. I mean, do we really want to use chemicals, synthetic chemicals that have never been on the planet before, that will stay on the planet long after we're gone? That's the sort of risk that I'm unwilling to take when it comes to investing in the next generation of chemistry and technology. So I think that for this class in particular, it's so clear how they're all tied together. And that I think differentiates it from even some of the other classes we'll be talking about.
So what comes up for me when I think about the fluorinated chemicals, and specifically products that we come into contact regularly, is they confer a slipperiness, the water repellency, grease repellency. And so that's going to what Marty had said earlier. This is a function that they provide, so it's something that you might be able to avoid, even if it's not listed on a label that it contains fluorinated chemicals. And a personal story, I have a sunscreen that I use every morning, and it goes on really nicely. It just feels great. It has a nice smoothness. And so it dawned on me, this might contain fluorinated chemicals. And so I called the manufacturer to find out. And thankfully it doesn't, but it could have. And so that's something for folks in the audience, people listening in, to think about. If there's something that you use all the time that is really slippery, it has some of these functions that we're talking about, it's something to think about.
I was telling Jen before this affair here that I was reading a recent story about a wondrous product for taking the persistent PFOAs out of water. So PFOAs, even though they've been phased out, they're all over the place, as Marty was saying. They're everywhere throughout the world, and they're in water in particular. So this clever team from Northwestern and Cornell developed this filter to take these pollutants out of the water using cyclodextrin, which is a ring sugar, and other ingredients to collect these pollutants out of the water. Does a much better job than activated charcoal, say, or other techniques. There's just one itty-bitty problem, and that is that what's cross-linked to the cyclodextrin is another perfluorinated compound. So, this idea of persistence is there, but if we keep manufacturing solutions that add to the problem, it's not really going to help us. That's why I like the 6 classes approach. Let's start there. Let's look at that idea of function and the functional spectrum of our needs. Again, back to the market needs. Is it saving a life? Is it promoting health? Is it merely for comfort? Is it for convenience? And so on and so forth. And then we can make some of these decisions about where to reduce our use of these things. Keen Footwear is a great example. At Keen Footwear, they took a look at the substances list and the requirements for DWR, or durable water repellency, and they looked at their product line, looked at over 100 bills of materials for their products, and reviewed those, looked at performance, and before they even looked at substitutions of the materials, they realized in many of their products they didn't need it. They didn't need it in the kids' sandals. They didn't need it in some of the other products. So they were able to actually reduce their costs and reduce the materials in their product line without even having to do extensive testing for substitutions. So that kind of thing I think is a great example of trying to look at function overall. And there are many different ways, and we do this in the Greener Solutions class, that Marty instituted, where we look at all sorts of different parameters of a problem. Is it a system? Is it a material? Is it a process? Well, how can you solve it? Can you solve it through time, energy, information? A lot of our disruptive innovations today really have to do with information. So lots of ways to solve these problems, and along that whole decision tree, I think we should look at them all.
Thank you. And along that line, I thought I would share that a number of industries are really interested in stopping the use of these chemicals. For example, the commercial furniture manufacturers, a lot of them are quite happy to stop using them in fabric. And a couple of the big companies came to me and said, well, we're stopping the use of the whole class in our fabrics, but if a customer asks for it, of course, we'll give it to them. But there's this little ball bearing deep inside our office chairs, and it just doesn't spin well without PFASs, highly fluorinated chemicals. What do you think? And I said, I think that's fine. If you get rid of it on all your textiles and stop using it, except when somebody really needs it, that's a huge step forward. And if you're only using a little ball bearing, and then they said, and we're doing research to find an alternative in the ball bearing. So I think that's what we need to do. We're not going to ever ban all PFASs, but there should be a need. Or if a customer thinks they need it, that's fine, but they shouldn't be routinely used. So I think the good news is what I've heard is at least the commercial furniture industry, a lot of the companies, before they always used them unless you didn't want them, and now they don't use them unless you ask for them. And that's the kind of change that probably reduces the use, 75, 90% in office furniture, which is really a good thing. So I see a little pile of questions now, so I'm going to see what we have. I have recently heard that long-chain, highly fluorinated chemicals have been banned from food wrappers. Is this true? Should long-chain and short-chain be banned from food wrappers? So I think Marty might be our expert on this. Jen's the expert on this, yeah. Here, I'll pass you the question.
So FDA has banned 2 long-chain chemicals, PFOA and PFOS, from take out food packaging, so the papers and boxes, et cetera. But there are a number of fluorinated chemicals that are still allowed by the FDA in food contact materials. So we are still seeing fluorinated chemicals in probably about a little bit more than half of the food contact materials that are in use in takeout food packaging, as well as boxes and things like that that contain cereal or whatnot. So they are still around, but there are alternatives. So the other 40% of food packaging doesn't contain these fluorinated chemicals. So in San Francisco, we actually are looking at how we can reduce the use of these chemicals in food packaging, because they do transfer from the packaging to food. And for us in San Francisco, we're really concerned that because we require all soiled food contact papers to go into compost, that those materials are going to go into compost and they will never degrade. They don't get broken down by the microbes in a compost heap. So we don't want that to be sticking around and then potentially be applied to food crops later, because they can be taken up by food. So we are definitely looking at pushing the market by, this is maybe a situation where we would ban the use of fluorinated chemicals in food contact paper, because it actually will continue to cycle through back into food, and we don't want that.
Yeah, and just really quickly on the question of alternatives in food contact paper, and also in some of the other uses that were discussed in the video, the alternatives aren't necessarily drop-in replacements where you're using another chemical in the same way, but for food contact, you have many options of what sort of material it's made out of, some of which you would never use perfluorinated coatings on. Other of which we also have issues of chemicals of concern. We don't particularly like polystyrene in food contact packaging either. So food contact is a place where it's really important to take this approach, a proactive approach to look for materials that are inherently safer and that don't rely on the use of perfluorinated chemicals to provide their performance. So looking for safe, biodegradable, and bio-based food contact packaging is certainly an area of interest for us, and I think a lot of folks in the in society and in business. And the question that I have in front of me that is related to another place where you find these is, are there alternatives and initiatives within the skiing industry to discourage the use of PFASs in ski wax? So floral waxes are something that are used and are actually quite expensive, but are used in high-end skis. And actually the application of those that uses heat is one of the ways that people really get exposed to high levels. So ski wax appliers have very high body burdens of PFASs. So it is a place where, especially for your recreational skier, asking the question, is this necessary, is a super important thing to do, because there are alternatives that are either based on silicone or based on other waxes that don't involve perfluorinated chemistry. So you are seeing more of those alternatives come onto the market. And so you get a lot of the same performance, maybe not 100% of the performance, maybe it's only 90 or 95%. But for most of us, that's certainly enough. And if you do use fluorinated waxes, really making sure they're applied in a safe setting is quite important. So, we can get 95% of the way there by asking, is it necessarily, and maybe protect that last 5% by making sure you're doing it in a responsible manner.
And I have a question for me here, and I'll probably ask Marty for some help because he's our uber chemist in the room, one of our uber chemists. Are there alternative chemistries to make water-resistant clothing? We were just, Nick Wax, I guess, comes to mind, a company out of the UK where we're using waxes to provide water repellency. And a lot of the companies that we're looking at right now in preparation for a fall course are really looking at DWR, which is durable water repellency, but they're also looking, allied with that, they're looking at motor oil stains, dirt stains, and so on and so forth in this spectrum. And some of these materials are doing that multitasking, if you will, for those things. So again, getting to a finer grain of making decisions about where you need it and when you need it. Chemours company has made a new product called Zelon R3 that we're looking at as well. It's non-fluorinated. It provides stain resistance and water repellency. I haven't looked at what the formula is, but it has been approved by Bluesign, and it was also on the ChemSpec market, which is a Swedish market for alternative materials. So that bodes well, and it sort of points to the fact that sometimes someone like me, I'm not a chemist, but I do rely on experts that I trust to give me at least an indication of where I should be looking at something. And I think that's something that we can all learn as consumers or as specifiers, designers, purchasers. Who do you trust? Where are the third-party assessment people? And take a look at what's on their websites or their information to at least start a path towards positive or negative judgment about something.
So I'll take a question, which is, what is the science of short chains? And the two long-chain, highly fluorinated chemicals, PFOA and PFAS, we've known about the harm starting in the 60s. It actually took about 50 years to phase them out. They were phased out in 2015. And as you saw in the video, the replacement for C8 was C6, C4, C3, and a whole lot of other molecules. And they are marketed as the environmentally preferable alternatives and marketed as PFOA-free. And if you're a chemist, you can believe that C6, which is 6 carbons surrounded by fluorines, is not going to contain C8, which is 8 carbons surrounded by fluorines. However, the reality is the, quote, environmentally preferable alternative, the C6s, C4s, also never break down in the environment. We don't know so much about their health effects, but the few that have been studied show causes for concern. But they have other properties, environmental properties, that are less desirable than the C8s. So because they're so small, they move faster in water, so they spread faster. And if you have C6 on your hot dog wrapper or fast food wrapper, and it goes in the compost bin, and then the nice organic compost grows fruits and vegetables, it turns out that the short chains will move faster into the plants, and you find more short chain in fruits and vegetables that are grown in contaminated soil than long chain. The other big problem with the short chain is there are literally hundreds of them. We don't know about them. They're not regulated. So this is the classic regrettable substitution and a huge worry because so many products that have highly fluorinated chemicals are now using short chains. So this is a really important way. I think we can all be healthier if instead of going to short chains, we ask, is this function really necessary? And then, as we keep saying, if it's really necessary, to invest in green chemistry innovation. So here, I'm going to pass Marty a hard question. And I don't know if anyone...
Yep. So this question reads, REACH has an element designed to encourage innovation in green chemistry, but we are finding companies are adverse to this and are substituting molecule by molecule. How can innovation be institutionalized more deeply? And I think this is an important question and one that also asks where should the innovation be happening? So I think too often, and this is even the case in REACH to a certain extent, the innovation is expected to happen at large chemical companies. And while large chemical companies are very good at what they do, which is producing large amounts of chemicals, they're often locked in both because of the capital they've spent in building their plants, but also because of their knowledge to a very limited range of solutions. So we find that one way to encourage innovation and innovation that gets away from the 6 classes of concern is to look closer to the consumer. Look at people who are designing new products, designing new materials that inherently don't use the 6 classes. So one way to really incentivize a culture of innovation is to look to what is the demand, what does the consumer want in terms of function, and what are all the ways that we can provide that function rather than a chemical by chemical approach. It is very hard. I would say the perfluorinated chemistry is actually the one example where, because there's been so much demand on the consumer side, especially in textiles, you're seeing both small and large companies come up with solutions. So you have small companies like Beyond Surface Technologies with a bio-based solution to durable water repellent. You heard the solution from Chemours coming up. That's what happens when you look at the in-demand rather than just saying we want an alternative to C8s. That's how you end up with C6.